January 1942 was the month America realized it could lose the war before firing a single shot. Pearl Harbor killed sailors, but Japan's invasion of Southeast Asia killed something far more critical: American mobility. In 3 weeks, Japanese forces captured 92% of the world's natural rubber supply. Every rubber plantation from Malaya to the Dutch East Indies now belonged to the enemy. The math was brutal and unforgiving. A single Sherman tank required 1 ton of rubber. A battleship demanded 75 tons. America's national stockpile held just 1 million tons, while war consumption devoured 600,000 tons annually. The arsenal of democracy had 12 months before its tanks became immobile monuments and its planes became grounded paperweights. The crisis was existential. Without rubber, there would be no war effort, no invasion of Europe, no liberation of the Pacific, just steel carcasses rusting in Detroit factories while the world burned. But here's what Japan didn't anticipate. American chemists were about to do something nature had never done. They were going to build a tree that didn't need soil, sunlight, or 7 years to mature. They were going to forge rubber from petroleum and fire in a process so violent it would make volcanoes look gentle. This is the story of how America fabricated nature itself to win World War II. To understand the magnitude of the crisis, you need to understand rubber's biological tyranny. The Hevea brasiliensis tree, native to the Amazon basin, was the only commercially viable source of natural rubber on Earth. These trees required 7 years from seedling to first latex harvest. 7 years of perfect tropical climate, specific soil chemistry, and constant maintenance. The British had transplanted these trees to Malaya and Ceylon in the late 1800s, creating vast plantation empires that controlled global supply. By 1941, Southeast Asia produced 98% of the world's rubber, while America consumed 660,000 tons per year for tires, gaskets, hoses, belts, and countless military applications. The United States had built the most mechanized military in human history on a supply chain controlled by colonial powers 8,000 miles away across submarine-infested oceans. The dependency was absolute. American industry had spent decades optimizing around natural rubber's unique properties. Its elasticity, heat resistance, and durability under friction were unmatched by any known material. Early attempts at synthetic alternatives had failed spectacularly. Hermann Bunna, rubber developed in the 1930s, was too brittle for high-speed applications and degraded rapidly under heat. DuPont's neoprene, while chemically impressive, cost 10 times more than natural rubber and lacked the right properties for tires and military equipment. By December 1941, synthetic rubber production in the United States totaled a pathetic 231 tons annually, barely enough to supply a single factory for a week. Japan's strategy was devastatingly simple: control the plantations, strangle Allied logistics, win the war through industrial asphyxiation. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces swept through British Malaya, capturing Singapore and its massive rubber stockpiles. The Dutch East Indies fell next, delivering Java's plantations into enemy hands. By February 1942, the rising sun flag flew over 3.5 million acres of rubber trees. America's industrial jugular had been severed. President Roosevelt understood the stakes immediately. In June 1942, he appointed Bernard Baruch, the legendary financier and industrial mobilizer from World War I, to lead the Rubber Survey Committee. Baruch's diagnosis was blunt and terrifying. His report to Congress declared that the failure in rubber is the failure in the war. Without a domestic synthetic rubber industry, America would be defeated not on battlefields but in supply ledgers. The committee's mandate was impossible by peacetime standards: create a synthetic rubber industry from absolute zero that could produce 800,000 tons annually by the end of 1944. That meant building an entirely new chemical sector in 18 months, a task that would normally require a decade of research, development, and construction. The solution requires something unprecedented in American capitalism: total cooperation among bitter rivals. Goodyear, Firestone, and Goodrich had spent decades guarding their patents and processes like nuclear secrets. Now, under government order, they were forced to share everything. Every formula, every reactor design, every hard-won chemical insight had to be pooled into a common knowledge base. It was industrial socialism in service of national survival. The target molecule was GRS, government rubbers, a synthetic polymer that could replicate natural rubber's properties through pure chemistry. The formula was deceptively simple: 75% butadiene and 25% styrene to hydrocarbon molecules that don't exist in nature in usable quantities. Both had to be ripped from petroleum through processes that resembled controlled explosions more than traditional manufacturing. The first step was thermal cracking, and it was as violent as it sounds. Crude oil was pumped into massive steel furnaces and heated to 1,200 degrees Celsius, temperatures hot enough to melt rock. At these infernal temperatures, the long hydrocarbon chains in petroleum literally shattered under thermal stress, breaking apart into smaller molecules, including butadiene and styrene. The furnaces were cathedral-sized structures of reinforced steel, glowing orange from internal heat, fed continuously by pipelines carrying thousands of gallons of crude oil per hour. Workers described the roar as deafening, a constant industrial thunder that vibrated through the concrete floors. The heat was so intense that protective gear could only allow 15-minute shifts near the furnace faces. The gases produced by thermal cracking were then captured and separated through fractional distillation, a process that sorted molecules by weight and boiling point. Butadiene and styrene were isolated, purified, and prepared for the next stage: polymerization. This was where chemistry became alchemy. Inside massive steel reactors operating at 200 pounds per square inch of pressure, butadiene and styrene were mixed with water, soap, and chemical catalysts. The mixture was heated to 50 degrees Celsius and agitated violently for 12 to 18 hours. The soap acted as an emulsifier, suspending tiny droplets of the monomers in water where they could collide and bond into long polymer chains. The smell inside these facilities was unforgettable. Sweet gasoline mixed with sulfur and burnt sugar, a chemical perfume that clung to workers' clothes and hair. What emerged from the reactors was a milky white latex that looked remarkably similar to the sap tapped from rubber trees. But this latex was born from fire and pressure, not photosynthesis. It was then coagulated, washed, dried, and pressed into massive bales of synthetic rubber ready for manufacturing. The material properties were extraordinary. GRS could withstand the heat generated by high-speed tire friction, something early synthetics couldn't do. It was durable, elastic, and most importantly, it could be produced at scale, limited only by petroleum supply and industrial capacity. The construction phase was a mobilization miracle that deserves its own chapter in engineering history. Between 1942 and 1944, the United States built 51 synthetic rubber plants simultaneously across Texas, Louisiana, Ohio, and California. These weren't small facilities. Each plant covered hundreds of acres, contained miles of pipeline, dozens of reactor vessels, and required its own dedicated power supply. Ground was broken and full production achieved in 12 to 18 months per facility, a construction timeline that would be considered impossible in peacetime when similar chemical plants took 5 to 7 years to build. The workforce was equally remarkable. With millions of men deployed overseas, the synthetic rubber industry relied heavily on women, who comprised 67% of the workforce by 1944. These weren't office jobs. Women operated chemical reactors, monitored pressure gauges, maintained equipment, and worked 24-hour rotating shifts in conditions that were brutal by any standard. Factory floors reached 43 degrees Celsius from the heat of the processes. The constant roar of forging presses, pumps, and ventilation systems made hearing protection mandatory. Chemical exposure was a daily reality, with workers developing chronic coughs and skin irritations that were considered acceptable wartime sacrifices. Veteran mechanics from the automotive industry were retrained as chemical operators, learning to read reactor temperatures, adjust catalyst ratios, and troubleshoot polymerization problems on the fly. The learning curve was steep and the consequences of error were severe. Reactor explosions, chemical fires, and toxic gas releases killed dozens of workers during the rapid scale-up phase. But production never stopped. The plants operated continuously, with maintenance performed during brief shutdowns that were planned with military precision. The logistics infrastructure required to support this new industry was staggering. Petroleum pipelines were rerouted to prioritize chemical plants over civilian refineries. Steel rationing, already severe for consumer goods, was redirected to manufacture reactor vessels and pressure tanks. Rail networks were reconfigured to transport butadiene and styrene between production facilities and rubber manufacturing plants. The entire industrial base of the United States was reorganized around a single mission: produce synthetic rubber or lose the war. The production numbers tell a story of exponential growth that defies normal industrial scaling. In 1941, America produced 231 tons of synthetic rubber, barely enough for a few thousand tires. By 1943, production had exploded to 231,000 tons, a thousand-fold increase in just 2 years. By 1945, American synthetic rubber production reached 1 million tons annually, completely replacing the natural rubber supply that Japan had captured. The chemical forest that America built from petroleum and fire was producing rubber faster than nature ever could. The strategic implications were devastating for Japan. The Japanese military had based its entire war strategy on the assumption that controlling natural rubber plantations would give them an insurmountable logistical advantage. They were correct that rubber was critical. They were catastrophically wrong about America's ability to innovate around the constraint. While Japan invested resources in defending and transporting rubber from occupied territories, America invested in chemical plants that couldn't be bombed or blockaded, while Japanese rubber shipments were hunted by American submarines in the Pacific. American synthetic rubber traveled safely by rail from Texas to Detroit. The biological limits of natural rubber became Japan's strategic prison. Rubber trees take 7 years to mature and can't be rushed, no matter how much resources you invest. Even if Japan had planted every available acre with new rubber trees in 1942, those trees wouldn't produce latex until 1949, long after the war was decided. Japan had conquered a forest, but America had built one from petroleum and fire in 1/50th the time. The irony was brutal. Territorial conquest, the foundation of imperial strategy, had been rendered obsolete by chemical engineering. The contrast between 1942 America and 2024 America is uncomfortable and revealing. In 1942, faced with an existential supply chain crisis, the United States built 51 massive industrial facilities in 18 months, created an entirely new chemical industry, and achieved complete self-sufficiency in a critical war material. The response was domestic, physical, and permanent. Those synthetic rubber plants, built in the white heat of wartime urgency, continued operating for decades. Some facilities constructed in 1943 were still producing rubber in the 1990s, a 50-year operational lifespan that justified every dollar and every sacrifice. Today, America faces a similar crisis in semiconductor manufacturing. Taiwan produces 92% of the world's advanced semiconductors, the exact same percentage of global supply that Japan controlled in rubber in 1942. The parallel is almost eerie. Yet the response has been radically different. Instead of building domestic production capacity at wartime speed, the United States has spent years debating subsidies, negotiating with foreign manufacturers, and optimizing supply chains for cost efficiency rather than resilience. The CHIPS Act, passed in 2022, allocated funds for semiconductor fabs that won't be operational until the late 2020s at the earliest. That's a 5 to 7-year timeline for facilities that 1942 America would have built in 18 months. The shift from physical resilience to digital fragility is everywhere. Modern supply chains are optimized for just-in-time delivery, minimizing inventory costs by relying on perfectly synchronized global logistics. This works beautifully in peacetime and catastrophically in crisis. When the container ship Ever Given blocked the Suez Canal for 6 days in 2021, global trade flows were billions of dollars in goods were delayed because a single ship got stuck in a canal. The system had no redundancy, no buffer, no resilience. It was efficient right up until the moment it failed completely. The dependency on Chinese rare earth minerals mirrors the 1942 rubber crisis even more directly. China controls over 80% of global production of lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements that are critical for batteries, electronics, and military systems. These materials are the rubber of the 21st century, and America has allowed the same strategic vulnerability to develop. The difference is that in 1942, America recognized the threat and responded with overwhelming industrial force. In 2024, America recognizes the threat and responds with committee meetings and 10-year plans. The cultural shift is perhaps even more significant than the industrial one. The generation that built the synthetic rubber industry believed in physical production as the foundation of national power. They built steel furnaces, chemical reactors, and pipeline networks because they understood that real sovereignty comes from the ability to make things, not just design them. Today's economy prioritizes intellectual property, software, and financial engineering over physical manufacturing. We've convinced ourselves that it's more efficient to outsource production to other countries while we focus on higher value activities like app development and marketing. But efficiency and resilience are often opposites. The most efficient supply chain is fragile by definition because it has no waste, no redundancy, no excess capacity to absorb shocks. The 1942 synthetic rubber industry was wildly inefficient by modern standards. It required massive government investment, forced cooperation among competitors, and produced rubber that initially costs more than natural rubber. But it was resilient. It couldn't be blockaded, bombed, or captured. It gave America the independence to fight and win a global war. The question that should haunt every strategic planner is simple. Could 2024 America replicate 1942 America's industrial mobilization? Could we build 51 advanced manufacturing facilities in 18 months if national survival depended on it? The honest answer is probably not. We've lost the industrial base, the skilled workforce, the institutional knowledge, and perhaps most critically, the cultural willingness to prioritize national resilience over quarterly earnings reports. We've traded the capacity for self-sufficiency for the convenience of global supply chains, and we won't know if that was a catastrophic mistake until the next crisis forces us to find out. The synthetic rubber miracle of World War II remains one of the greatest industrial achievements in human history. It proved that when faced with existential threat, American ingenuity, industrial capacity, and sheer determination could overcome constraints that seemed absolute. The chemical trees built from oil and fire in 1942 still dominate global rubber production today. Synthetic rubber accounts for roughly 70% of worldwide rubber consumption, a permanent legacy of wartime innovation. Some of the chemical processes developed under wartime pressure became the foundation for the entire petrochemical industry that followed, spawning plastics, synthetic fibers, and countless other materials. But the deeper legacy is philosophical. The synthetic rubber program demonstrated that true national sovereignty doesn't come from having the largest military or the most advanced technology. It comes from the capacity to create what you need to survive when the world tries to deny it to you. It comes from steel furnaces that can run at 1,200 degrees Celsius 4 years without stopping. It comes from workers who will endure chemical exposure and 16-hour shifts because they understand the stakes. It comes from the willingness to build physical infrastructure that will outlast the crisis that created it. The tree of oil and fire stands as a monument to a different kind of American power. Not the power to consume, but the power to produce. Not the power to optimize, but the power to endure. Not the power of algorithms and financial instruments, but the power of furnaces, reactors, and human hands that can forge survival from raw materials and raw will. In 1942, when Japan controlled the rubber and America controlled nothing, chemists built a forest from petroleum and proved that freedom doesn't come from what you can buy. It comes from what you can make when everything else is taken away.